Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our seventh Urban Shift webinar. My name is Sharon Hill, and I work on sustainable urban development at the UN Environment Program. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event today, where we will explore how urban nature can drive equity and inclusiveness in cities. Of course, today we will be focusing on Mexico City, so we're very excited to hear from our colleagues in Mexico. Before we get started, let me just run through a bit of housekeeping. This webinar will be moderated in English, but we also have presentations in Spanish. Interpretation in English, Spanish, and French will be available during this webinar. You can enable it by clicking interpretation at the bottom of your screen and selecting the language that best suits you. Second, we would welcome any questions you have for our speakers today or about the program itself, UrbanShift. So please post this in the Q&A box as shown in the slides. Thank you for showing, Margot. For those of you who don't already know, UrbanShift is an initiative funded by the Global Environment Facility and led by the UN Environment Program in partnership with the World Resources Institute, C40 Cities, ICLE, and the ICLE, the UN Development Program, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. UrbanShift focuses on transforming 23 cities in 9 countries through integrated urban planning approaches and building capacity to shift to greener and healthier economies. For the next hour, we will have a series of presentations and discussions with experts on the topic of urban biodiversity and how it can be a powerful tool to create inclusive and equitable cities, and the lessons from the latest practices in Mexico City. So we will kick off the discussion with a keynote from my distinguished colleague, Pierre Boileau, who leads UNEP's development of the Global Environment Outlook, or GEO for short. His intervention will focus on the GEO for cities, which highlights green and just cities. This keynote will be followed by a panel of 4 distinguished speakers, whom I will introduce after Pierre's intervention. A reminder again that we will finish with a Q&A, so please write down your questions. Please don't hesitate in the Q&A box. We're all really eager to learn more about the strong and complex relationship between urban nature and equity. So let's move to the substance of things. I would like to invite Pierre-Henri Boileau to share the key findings from UNEP's GEO for Cities report. Pierre, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Sharon. I hope everybody can hear me. I am going to go through a few slides related to the GEO for Cities, which was begun by UNEP after the launch of the main Global Environment Outlook report. We began our journey to produce the GEO for Cities in May 2019, and it was officially launched in November 2021. We had quite a distinguished group of authors who came to help us understand what it meant to be a green and just city. We also had an advisory committee with ICLE, C40 Cities, Cities Alliance, International Institute for Environment and Development, ODI, Indian Institute for Housing, and the Global Council for Science and the Environment were on our advisory committee. We spent 2 years really researching this, and if I could ask the organizer to move to the next slide. Thank you. We have 5 chapters in the report. First of all, we create a bit of context by explaining why we needed a GEO for Cities. Certainly after producing the main GEO report, there were a number of findings around the need to phase out fossil fuels, the need to transform our food systems, the need to achieve circular economies. All those came out of the main GEO report, and we wanted to explain what that meant for cities in general. We also wanted to explore how cities function under urban dynamics for environmental action and the barriers that might exist in cities to achieve that environmental action. And we found there were three key what we called lock-ins in the report. These were called political economy lock-ins, habit and education lock-ins, and multi-level governance lock-ins. So there are certain things that cities need to overcome before they can become green and just. We also explored what the state of the environment was in cities, how cities can work for people and planet. We developed a vision of what a green and just city would be. And then we explored finally the pathways to achieving that vision. Next slide, please. So it's clear from the analysis that we did that biodiversity, nature in cities, around cities, can actually dramatically improve the lives of urban residents, but can also lead to what we call green gentrification. So an inequity in the city where green spaces are mainly available to those who have wealth and power, and the more disadvantaged people in the city don't have access to those. So it really is a transformation of a city has to take into account the natural ecosystem services that that nature provides, as well as the need to have everybody in the city have access to those ecosystem services. The ecosystem services that we speak about are provisioning services. So these are perhaps outside the city. They provide food, medicines, and fuel to the city. There are regulating services that can happen within the city by having natural habitats that produce clean water and clean air. And then there are cultural services such as recreation and spiritual fulfillment that can be provided by nature in cities. However, we really have to watch out for this question of equity. Actually, biological resources within cities are unevenly distributed. As I said, those with more wealth and power in cities typically have more access to those green spaces, and they can build their houses in those green spaces. And those who are underrepresented or disadvantaged don't have access to those. Of course, the reduction in ecosystem services, if nature is harmed in cities or outside cities, can intensify the situation by exacerbating the impacts on disadvantaged populations, different genders, and can lead to equity biases. Next slide, please. So our goal in Geo for Cities was really to try and find out what would be needed to create an equitable, a just and nature-rich city. The vision that we had was to try and create this nature-rich city, this green city with equity built in. And it was necessary to actually break down that vision into three dimensions. One was a vision of net zero circular cities, where energy, water, food, materials, waste, and emissions are managed in a way that benefits the citizens of the city. There was a second dimension, which was building resilience into cities and making sure they are environmentally sustainable. So that is cities that have nature, that have a sustainable urban environment, and have sustainable urbanism built into the planning process for the city. And then finally, the dimension number 3, which we called inclusive and just cities, really had this multi-species component where humans are not the only residents of cities. We have animal life and biological life, flora and fauna in the city that have to be recognized and become part of the city. So that was our vision. And we tried as much as possible to take that vision into a solutions focus and develop pathways to achieving those 3 dimensions. I'll speak specifically about the inclusive and just cities pathway in the next slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so this inclusive and just city requires what we call a renaturing of the city, built in with equity. And there were four main pathways to achieving that. One is, first of all, securing the right to the city for multiple species by transforming and grounding urban governance processes and deepening democratic practices. This allows for the recognition that the city itself is not simply a human habitat. It is a habitat for flora and fauna, for other life forms that also should have access to the city and should have access to the benefits of the city. The second pathway was to build justice beyond the city. We recognize that cities have large environmental footprints, and we need to tackle the impacts that cities impose upon these distant elsewheres. So these places where food is grown, fuel is extracted, resources come to the city from these other locations, and we need to recognize that the city has that impact, and we need to build justice into that impact. Finally, just before we go to the last one, we need to inject equity considerations such as racial justice into the pursuit of environmental sustainability. It can't be an afterthought. It has to become part of the development of this environmentally sustainable city. And then finally, really getting to the green and just city requires, in many cities, an effort to renature the city, to rebuild nature into the city, to enhance health and well-being of all citizens, urban biodiversity, building in urban biodiversity, and the provision of ecosystem services, which also can provide resilience to climate shocks. We've seen this in cities that have been impacted by climate events. And we need to have electrified transportation systems to try and minimize or maximize the amount of mitigation that cities provide for the climate crisis. So these four pathways, I think, are well defined and explained in the GEO for cities. They require, I think, significant action at the government level, but also at the business and social level, at society level, to be well managed and well brought through to achieve this green and just city. We have these pathways, we have the vision. I think it's quite useful to have the science behind and the evidence behind these to be able to say that they are possible and they can actually be implemented in cities today. Thank you very much. I think that's it. Oh, pardon me. Thank you, Sharon. There's an urgent need for reconfiguring. Of course, the main findings of the GEOs for cities are an urgent need to reconfigure how cities function, to address these critical environmental problems and achieve these just outcomes for people and nature. It's not easy, and there's no simple guidebook, but we must take inspiration and action from what information we have. And we need to take risks to confront underlying issues, especially risks when the timing is opportune. And the timing is usually when there is a crisis at some point, there is an opportunity for transformational change. And so that risk taking can be combined or taken at a time when it's most opportune. And a better future is possible for our cities and our planet, and we cannot be afraid to take action to make these visions a reality. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pierre. And it's a very nice picture of everybody who was part of this report. I was there at the very beginning as well, and it was just amazing to be to share that experience with a lot of great minds. I found it very interesting, the multi-dimensional approach to equity, and I think that as we listen to our panelists as well, you've given us a really good starting point. So I would like to invite our panelists to turn their cameras on and join the virtual stage. To showcase how what Pierre said can be applied to cities worldwide, and with a special focus to the work of Mexico City. We will be hearing today from John Rob Poole, Manager of Knowledge and Partnerships for UrbanShift at WRI, who will give us an overview of how green space can foster equity in cities. Welcome, John Rob. We will also be joined by Jose Alberto Lara Pulido, founder of Ecopoliticas, who will outline the findings of a mapping of urban gardens in Mexico City, which was recently conducted. Congratulations on that work, Jose Alberto. Michelle Montijo is also joining us. She's the coordinator of biodiversity strategies of the Secretariat of the Environment, SEDEMA, of Mexico City. Welcome, Michelle. And finally, last but not least, Luisa Miranda Morel, Senior Manager of the Inclusive Climate Action Forum and Academies of C40 Cities. We work very closely with C40 and UrbanShift, so we really welcome your intervention as well, Luisa. So first, over to John Rob. John Rob, I have a few questions to kick off the discussion. What is at stake when access to green space is unequal in a city? How can nature be a powerful tool to promote equity? And what are some of the considerations to have in mind to ensure benefits of these interventions?
Brilliant.
Over to you, John Rob.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sharon. Thanks for the kind introduction and for inviting me to participate in this webinar on a topic that's so close to my heart. I've been fortunate to work on it through UrbanShift and through previous experiences, so I'm happy to share some of the learnings that I've come across over the past few years. So Sharon, to your first question, what's at stake when access to green space is unequal in a city? Well, simply put, when urban green space is unevenly distributed and planned, it can unintentionally worsen social inequalities. So the expanding and protecting of green spaces without intentional efforts to achieve social equity, which, as we know, aims to achieve fair and equal outcomes for all, can worsen spatial and social inequalities and reinforce the lack of access to the benefits that urban green spaces provide for marginalized communities. I think it's no secret amongst us here that low-income residents who typically have less access to quality urban green spaces are more likely to live in hotter neighborhoods, be exposed to higher levels of air pollution, more likely to suffer the health impacts of heat waves and the impacts of stormwater flooding than their counterparts who live in more affluent and typically greener areas of cities. And this correlation between these impacts and the presence, or maybe I should say the lack thereof, of green amenities is increasingly being recognized by cities and practitioners as a cause for concern and a point for action. And so there are many reasons behind this correlation between lack of access to green space and social inequalities. Number one, installing and maintaining green infrastructure such as parks, bioswales, forest patches, street trees, riverbanks, and so on, often comes at high costs, which sometimes communities, especially lower income ones, are not able to shoulder the costs of. They're not able to afford them simply. Number two, in addition, the differences in these communities' political representation is juxtaposed oftentimes by cities' shorter-term economic interests, which are to attract wealthier residents and to attract tourists, and this may impact decision-making in public green spaces. Number three, land use and siting decisions for urban parks and green infrastructure may also disproportionately and inadvertently displace poorer, low-income, or informal communities who oftentimes lack land tenure and usage rights and the appropriate representation, as I mentioned earlier. Four, urban green spaces may also create barriers to equal access when they are not designed with an explicit goal to meet the needs of disadvantaged groups. such as women, people with disabilities, the elderly, children, youth, and so on. So that the type, the density, and the maintenance requirements of vegetation in urban green spaces often affects how safe people use when they use those green spaces. And this varies by gender, by age, by race, by socioeconomic status, and so on. So if I can give an example on this one, you may think that placing an urban park in a particular area that is devoid of green spaces may be a good thing, may result in reduced social inequalities. However, if you don't consider in the planning and the maintenance phase what you need to do to keep that park a safe space, you may inadvertently prevent access for women, for example. So if there's not enough lighting at nighttime, or if there is vegetation that is very overgrown, that isn't maintained often enough, that may present as a barrier for women to access and to feel like they can use the green space on a consistent basis. And then number 5 out of 5. I want to say that historically underserved and low-income neighborhoods also face the risk of green gentrification, which Pierre mentioned, which is the process through which new environmental amenities fuel socioeconomic exclusion and cultural alienation by transforming the neighborhood without addressing the needs of current residents. So without the appropriate foresight and regulation, green spaces' impact on property values, for example, can drive up housing prices, and in doing so can push out low-income residents who typically have been living in the particular area for a long term. And there are many examples of how this has happened from multiple cities around the world, and the tale is always the same. It's that the siting of a new park or a green space raised real estate values and attracted more wealthy people into the area, which invariably drives out long-term low and middle income residents who've been there for a long time. I'd say that the flip side of all of these is that there's many global green gentrification tales is that they offer us lessons from which we can learn and from which we can learn to do better. So to your second question, Sharon, and I'll be brief because I know that the time is tight, how can nature be a powerful tool to promote equity in cities? Well, we know that nature, right, in many varying forms, from forests to built green infrastructure to urban agriculture, etc., which we can broadly categorize as nature-based solutions, can help people in cities in a myriad of ways, right? From improving air quality, reducing extreme urban heat, mitigating the impacts of heavy rainfall and flooding, promoting mental and physical health, providing economic and livelihood opportunities, and even increasing food security in some instances, amongst others. But for this to work, for nature in cities to provide these benefits equally and to all residents, which means including low-income and marginalized groups, the interventions need to be planned very carefully. My top line message here is that urban green spaces can be a valuable tool to level the playing field for disadvantaged communities. But to achieve this, the projects that aim to enhance urban green space must be fair, and they must have buy-in from communities. So 3 main considerations. Number 1, municipalities, cities really need to establish strong political leadership that prioritizes underserved communities in urban green infrastructure projects, and that protects these long-term social benefits from short-term economic interests. Or maybe balances is a better word than protects. Number 2, protective and meaningful community engagement, participation with the community that you're intending to benefit is essential to ensuring the local buy-in and the agency in the green space expansion. This reminds me of a striking New York Times headline from January 2019. Folks might recall it. It said, "Free trees, many Detroit residents say no thanks." And what it was about was it went into detail about why Detroit residents in typically marginalized communities didn't want additional free trees. This was an effort that was planned to improve their local environment and to provide benefits to them. Didn't want those trees because of the added maintenance cost that they would bear down the line for maintaining those trees. So it's a consideration. You really need to engage with the community in planning urban green space projects. And then number 3, I would say that exploring the use of and leveraging innovative financing is key here. We know that equitable urban green planning requires innovative funding to help city governments put green spaces in underserved neighborhoods, whilst also protecting community ownership that prevents the green gentrification that we've been talking about. And cities can do this, for example, through exploring things like impact bonds, which allow municipalities to share the risk with investors, therefore reducing their liability and their upfront financing costs for green development projects. My closing words here, Sharon. Adopting a social equity lens in urban greening decision-making can really help make cities green spaces an essential tool to tackling existing inequalities in cities. And we do a lot of this work through UrbanShift, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us to explore our website for more information. Thank you.
Thanks, John Rob. And indeed, I really like the perspective of making green spaces useful, because they need to be part of the lives of the citizens, and that is in a way, looking at it from that lens makes it more equitable. So you've left us with a lot to think about, and from a global perspective. We now go deeper into the experience of Mexico City. Mexico City is actually one of the leading cities already harnessing nature to deliver a more equitable and sustainable future. When you think of Mexico City and having a very urban perspective, you will be pleasantly surprised to see that there's a flurry of flourishing initiatives in the capital, many of them initiated by the citizens themselves with support of the local government. It is now my pleasure to introduce Jose Alberto Lara Pulido, founder of Ecopoliticas, who has played a key role in a project that has helped us to understand the state of nature in Mexico City and its implications on the population. Jose Alberto and his team in Ecopoliticas has mapped the distribution of urban gardens in Mexico City and correlated it with socioeconomic data. So very relevant to our discussion today. What were some of the key findings of this exercise, Jose Alberto?
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. I will show you just 4 slides about the results and some links with the urban green areas in Mexico City. So as Sharon said, we did a mapping of urban gardens in Mexico City. It's a very recent work. We did that this year, in the past 3 months. So we visited a lot of urban gardens in Mexico City. We identified them by asking people, gardeners, about other gardeners and such. So we get to 160 urban gardens in Mexico City. The next slide, please. I will talk in these 4 slides about this map, about what is the relationship between marginalization and green space, about the relationship between green space and urban gardens, and finally, the relationship between marginalization and urban gardens. So the next, please. This is the map. It's available publicly at Google Maps. Here is the link. It's a short link for a Google Maps. So you want to copy that, or maybe we can put that on the chat. You will find the location of every 160 urban gardens that we visited. We carried out a survey, a very long survey, for 2 hours for each garden, to gather a lot of information about management practices, governance, income and expenses, among others. What you will see in this map is just the location, the name of the garden, and some photographs of the garden. We are processing this data. Well, we have a report on this data, but it is not publicly available. But I think that if you are very interested in that, we can share that by asking for that. So what we find in these gardens, in these visits, we found that gardeners are very willing to cooperate to strengthen networks between urban gardens. I think that is not a surprise for us, because we know that these people is very eager to participate, to collaborate. They have a lot of enthusiasm. So we confirm that with the data. Also, land tenure is an issue in several gardens. There are some examples of gardens that are occupying irregularly some places, some disputes between owners of the land and the gardeners. So it's not a generalized issue, but it is present in a share of the gardens. Most of the gardens are small in size, will not generate sufficient income, are highly dependent on government resources or donations, and in general are in a situation of vulnerability that prevents their financial sustainability. Again, I think this is not a surprise. It's a common finding in every city of the world that has urban gardens. There are not a source of commercial crops. They survive and they function because they have another benefits, another non-monetary benefits, such as social cohesion, recreational and educational spaces, among others. So we didn't find anything that we didn't expect. At the beginning of the work, we were expecting these results, but we confirmed them with actual data. So the next, please. This is a relationship between green areas in Mexico City and the levels of marginalization. Marginalization in Mexico, we measure it by an index, or is an index that takes into account socio-demographic and economic data at household level, and we build an index that it is published every year by some government agency. So this index is categorized in 5 categories: very high marginalization, medium, low, and very low. In this map, you are seeing in reds the areas where marginalization is higher in Mexico City, and in blue, where is the lowest, the marginalization. So as you can see, there is a negative relationship between green space and marginalization. I mean that where marginalization is the higher, we have less access to green space. So this is in concordance with what my colleague was talking about in the last presentation. The next, please. This is the relationship between green space and urban gardens. Well, this is just, it's not a very deep analysis. My slides are only raising questions. They are not answering questions, but I think that they raise interesting question. For example, here is just 23 urban gardens are in green areas. This is, well, just an illustration, an approximation that maybe urban gardens are negatively correlated to green spaces. I mean, there are, I'm talking this in Spanish, the next for the translator, please. Hay una
So there is a negative correlation between where the urban gardens are located and green areas. This may be due to the fact that urban gardens are, well, providing or are providing a substitute, a benefit.
The next slide. And this is the correlation between marginalizations and urban gardens. What we see here is a less spatial correlation between urban gardens and marginalizations. So the open question is, do urban gardens reduce social gaps? Maybe it's a substitute to green space. So as I said, this is not a statistical model. This is not, these only are open questions that arise by the results of our work on urban gardens. But I think that we have very useful information from Mexico City to test these relationships in further research. So that's all from me. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you, Jose Alberto. I want to know the answer to that question. I don't know about the rest of the audience, but indeed there seems it would be interesting to understand better the correlation in the case of Mexico City. But we will hear more from Mexico City because our next speaker from SEDEMA, represented by Michelle Montijo, will be speaking to us about equity and inclusion in the city through their urban greening strategies. Michelle, urban gardens were identified as one of the ways to address the challenges of access to green spaces and to implement Mexico City's urban greening strategy. Can you tell us a little bit more about it? What is your approach? And what are your considerations in terms of distribution and social benefits?
Sí, muchas gracias, Sharon.
Thank you, Sharon. And thank you to UNEP for this invitation and all the promotion that we get and the opportunity to promote these topics. And thank you for supporting us with translation services as well. Sharon, I'd like to be able to provide an answer to some of your questions, but before that, we have a bit of an overview. As we heard in the introduction today, when someone thinks of Mexico City, we usually associate the city to gray infrastructure. However, in the case of Mexico City, we are able to, well, to find this, to call ourselves lucky and to be able to find surprise in the fact that most of the lands in Mexico City are rural lands or conservation lands. Next slide, please. So, as I said, well, Mexico City is only represents less than 1% of the land of that is the country Mexico. So it's a very small city, and yet 1/6 of the country's population lives in Mexico City. Around 9 million inhabitants. In the metropolitan zone, we have altogether around 22 million inhabitants, and around 59% of the territory in the country. What we see here in the map is conservation or rural land inside Mexico City. So this is where most of the biological wealth of the city exists. 6 out of 10 types of vegetation in the city are concentrated in this southern region of the city, on this conservation land. There's also wide species biodiversity. Around 12% of the world's biodiversity exists in Mexico City in this zone, with a number of local species also living in this region. Next slide, please. This also poses a great challenge to the city. How to contain all this pressure of urban development and the urban population on nature and how to recover nature inside the city. These are challenges that are approached through the Environmental and Climate Change Program of Mexico City, which has 7 pillars, as we see on screen. The first one, which is concerning urban and rural revegetation, the recovery of rivers and other water bodies of water, sustainable water management, zero waste, an integrated and sustainable mobility system, as well as improving air quality, and what we call today a solar city. The purpose of these 7 pillars is to reduce our impact and guarantee the access to a healthy environment. These are all rights that are embedded in the Constitution of Mexico City, and through them we aim to improve the environmental factors of the city for all of its inhabitants. Next slide, please. So specifically regarding green infrastructure and green spaces, Mexico City has a special green infrastructure program, which has as a main aims to develop a connected network of green spaces that is connected, balanced, diverse, and resilient, and that helps improve the resilience of the city while also increasing the distribution and accessibility of public spaces in the city. So through the acknowledgement of these 9 regions in the city, each of which has similar conditions throughout the different regions, also considering the index or different the inventory of green spaces and biodiversity of these areas. 9 regions have been defined, and each one has its own projects that are geared towards facing climate change and increasing biodiversity in the city, having more connected spaces, and make a more sustainable use of water, reducing risks in the city, increasing the access to green areas. As we saw in the map before, the south of Mexico City, there is, like I said, conservation land with the natural ecosystems such as forests and other green areas. And taking into account the whole green surface per inhabitant, it's in the south of the city where we find the greatest extension of green surfaces. But there are some other municipalities where we have a very, very small access to green spaces. So through the Green Infrastructure Program, the purpose we have is to increase the access to these natural spaces for everyone. And of course, we also want to increase the enjoyment of our citizens to these spaces. Next slide, please. Together with the different areas of the departments of the Ministry of the Environment, we have work towards identifying the existing risks in the city in terms of flooding and the other climate-related phenomenon, as well as understanding the distribution of the different categories of spaces, of which some are natural protected areas or areas with environmental value or urban parks and forests, so that these can be, so that we can identify the way to create a better interconnectivity within the city of these green spaces, but also finding ways to improve access to them. And through the analysis of all these matters, such as habitability, the risks of flooding and other results of climate phenomena, we have been able to come up with some priority projects for the short and long term in Mexico City. Next slide, please. So this is where we see all these different actions, the revegetation actions in the city. From 2019 to date, around 34 million trees and other plants have been planted using the approaches that I have mentioned before, which has required an increase in the production of plants, and as well as increasing the use of native species in the city and aiming for different types of interventions, such as gardens for pollinators, as well as socio-environmental rehabilitation of natural protected areas through gardens for pollinators and other actions, as I will discuss in a minute. Next slide, please. These are some of the examples of the socio-environmental rehabilitation of natural protected areas that aim to provide a greater access to these spaces. We have a phenomenon in the city, which is that most of the population is unaware of the fact that Mexico City has 25 natural protected areas. Usually, when we think about natural protected areas, what comes to mind is let's go get away from the city and go somewhere green. But there are 25 natural protected areas inside the city. So some of the effort is aimed towards improving the conditions of these spaces so that these are safe spaces, accessible spaces for recreation and for leisure and visits. So these are some of the natural areas. Next slide, please. Regarding urban gardens, as previously mentioned by Jose Alberto, we have been lucky to collaborate with the United Nations, the UNEP, for the diagnosis of that will allow us to promote urban gardens as a nature-based solution for cities. This collaboration has had this purpose of creating a network of urban gardens to strengthen and multiply them. And thanks to the word of Ecopoliticas, Jose Alberto's team, we now know we have been able to identify the map of urban gardens, which we hope to continue strengthening in the future. This constitutes a baseline regarding the conditions and challenges facing these spaces, but also it has allowed us to create a link with our gardens in such a way that a system is integrated, a garden system is integrated to multiply these experiences. The garden system of Mexico City contains a number of hubs, community gardens, collectives of gardeners, school gardens, also a hub of the public sector, of the different agencies of the city government, working in these spaces with the idea that these gardens can become strengthened by adding new players, but also by multiplying them, by creating a hub maybe of some housing complexes in order to increase these and grow this network. Through this collaboration, we have been able to also identify other spaces within the city which have potential for urban gardening, and for these new urban gardens to become part of the green network and infrastructure network. And finally, I'd like to provide you two other examples of how we are approaching the recovery of nature within the city with a social approach. Next slide, please.
Michelle,
Program.
unfortunately, we don't have that much time anymore. So if I'd like to give you just one more minute to wrap up. There's so much to say about.
Perfecto. Sí, sí.
Thank you. Sorry. So two programs, the Garden for Pollinators, to increase green areas with native plants for pollinators, to increase the space for habitat for the species with a gender-based approach as well, because it focuses on training women in environmental gardening aspects so that they can be the ones who lead these initiatives in their communities, to create these types of gardens. And this has been supported not only by training, but also through creating other materials, such as a guide for a pollinator garden, which can be accessed by anyone. And finally, the last program, which is the cosecha de agua de lluvia, or rainwater harvesting program. Most of the water that we use in Mexico City comes from other basins outside the city. And so this is leading us to the need to find sustainable sources for the population. Around 35% of the population does not have access to water. And so this program aims to install rainwater systems in places where there's more scarcity of water, with a very important impact in women as well, because women are mostly in charge of the household work, and this has allowed for their time invested in obtaining water for their households to be reduced, because they have the ability to have these systems in their homes. So that's all I wanted to share with you. There are some
Thank
numbers
you,
on the screen.
Michelle. Sorry for interrupting, but thank you very much for sharing that rich experience in Mexico City. Without a lot of introduction, I'll move on now to Luisa, our colleague from C40. Luisa, Mexico City presented a lot of concrete actions and complexity of the issue. Could you tell us what are your recommendations to other cities to ensure that urban nature and the development of nature-based solutions in cities benefit particularly the most vulnerable?
Thank you, Sharon. I think I'll just skip to the next slide, please, and I'll just get right in there. Thank you to the previous presenters as well for their presentations. It's great to hear from Mexico City particularly. So my first recommendation is really to unpack, like with the question about benefiting the most vulnerable, it's first to unpack what we mean with benefiting, what we mean with vulnerability, and whose vulnerability we are talking about. So if we understand vulnerability to be a combination of factors such as exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, then I suggest that nature-based solutions in their design and in their delivery should aim to tackle exposure of people, mitigate the impact of any pre-existing sensitivities that people might have to climate change, and build the adaptive capacity of people in the city, for example, as Mexico's Mujeres Poliniciadoras is doing by supporting women with skills building and leadership building. So that's the first one. Next slide, please. The second thing is to really think, okay, whose vulnerability are we talking about? And it's important for cities to recognize that exposure and adaptive capacity are very much defined by a multitude of overlapping characteristics. And I think that's been alluded to already in previous discussion. This pyramid that you see on the left side of the slide comes from an expert in universal design and is quite useful in reminding us of the breadth of possibilities due to physical, cognitive, temporary, and/or permanent disabilities, age, and gender. And these define an individual's vulnerability. And there are several other characteristics illustrated on the right of the slide, such as gender, race, ethnicity, or belonging to an indigenous group that intersect the possibilities of the pyramid. So these overlapping characteristics can multiply the level of vulnerability or risk that an individual might face. And so they must not be overlooked in the design of nature-based solutions that aim to benefit the most vulnerable. Next slide, please. So the question is how, and there's numerous methods, but there's a couple that I want to elevate as best practices in my humble opinion. So the first one is spatial mapping, and Jose Alberto has already shown the importance of this in terms of the marginalization index and mapping other indicators which are key to tackling vulnerability. So really elevating that approach, I think, is key. And I want to draw on the experience from the city of Barcelona, who have mapped indicators such as energy poverty, thermal comfort, mental health, accessibility, and nutrition around the city, and found things such as women reporting worse impacts from energy poverty than men, and worse impacts from energy poverty on their mental health than men. And also they have found things like a correlation between energy poverty and food insecurity. So with these broader socioeconomic indicators overlaid with accessibility to green spaces, cities can really find synergies between broader set of vulnerabilities that can be jointly tackled with strategically located and inclusively designed nature-based solutions. For example, reducing the pressure on energy poor by providing cooling spaces during extreme heat waves, or by using community gardens like those from Mexico City as well that Michelle presented to tackle poor nutrition levels amongst neighborhoods. So this kind of broader mapping of socioeconomic indicators, I think is a key way of really making sure that investment in nature-based solutions is targeted towards the areas of the city where vulnerability is at its highest. Next slide, please. I think participatory evaluations are another best practice that stands out to me. So finding creative ways to integrate people who are a real reflection of those who will use these nature-based solutions or who will benefit or could benefit from them. An organization called Despacio, who is based in Bogota, provides a really innovative methodology to do this type of participatory evaluation by using urban planners who accompany individuals with specific cognitive or physical disabilities. And together they journey from point A to point B using public transport systems in a city. And along the way, they discuss feelings and barriers and attitudes experienced in the journey. And whilst this approach is really qualitative, it does provide a very rich information that can be used to improve design of spaces and processes in the city. And the methodology has been applied in Bogota, Santiago, Medellin, and Curitiba. And I'm talking about transport systems, but the principles behind this methodology can be used to understand barriers in not only the barriers, but also the use of nature-based solutions themselves by mapping experiences with the users. So if you go to the next slide, this is really just an example of how such a methodology can be used. Thinking, for example, of an individual who might have autism. Is this person in need of a quiet space, and therefore do they truly benefit through the wellness of the nature-based community garden, for example, benefit this individual? And these are like, for example, the noise component is something that we don't necessarily think about straight away. And so this is why this methodology is so important. Next. So finally, just to wrap up very quickly, I always really recommend trying to move from inclusive participatory processes that are very much kind of on a consultation base and tend to be project specific towards approaches that promote co-governance and institutional change for more inclusive decision-making and budgeting systems. And this means investing in inclusive engagement of frontline communities, especially those most vulnerable within the decision-making processes, but also building staff capacity, like within the cities, of those staff that are involved in the decision-making, and together jointly defining budgets. And I think that really is a key strategy for mitigating the potential impact of green gentrification, which were discussed earlier today. So at this point, I just want to elevate Montreal as a best practice because they have set up a universal accessibility advisory committee as an example that is regularly consulted in the design of their public spaces and their transport networks. And they really help understand the users' varying needs and behaviors, particularly of people with a variety of disabilities, which are a very vulnerable group in the face of climate change. So this type of approach is a mechanism for systemic change, and that's what we're really trying to get at when we talk about environmental and social justice. So that's it. I'll stop there. Those are kind of like my key recommendations, and I hope they're useful. Thank you.
Very useful indeed, Luisa. And it's good to see some of the concrete examples. In this, there were so many interesting questions. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to do the Q&A live, but my colleagues in the background have very ably responded in writing. And I'd like to ask them, Margot, Esteban, Elsa, Manal, to kindly show yourselves. And Marc-Aurélien, I think, is there as well. So just to publicly thank you for the support and the responses. We will try to post responses to the questions. There were so many that were quite interesting. Maybe just one, because I don't know, Pierre, if it would be okay to ask the one question that I think might be interesting for the audience.
Yeah, I don't know how well I can answer it, but I'll certainly take the
Yes.
question.
So there's, I just thought that it would be interesting, especially from Pierre, who's leading the G reports. There was a question around existing climatic and environmental conditions, like semi-arid to desert microclimates. How do we navigate such contexts? And I think this is interesting because in some cases, there are areas that used to not be as arid, or with the change in climatic conditions, there could be a need to do some restoration in some of these areas. So Pierre, could you tell us what would, in such contexts, how could we achieve a reasonable threshold of green infrastructure?
Yeah, I would point to two things, I think. One is the systematic observation financing facility, which is looking to try and install climatic monitoring systems all over the world. This SOF is now, I think, available to governments, especially in developing countries, to be able to build up a data set of the frequency of precipitation, the different issues of land degradation, drought and desertification in different areas. That, I think, would provide a data foundation for making decisions. But my own experience in Nairobi is that as different parts of the country become much drier, the use of indigenous plant species is absolutely essential because they are adapted to very dry climates and very intense rainy periods. So I think it's absolutely essential that we try and keep the nature where the nature is supposed to be able to bring it back to the cities.
I'm on mute, sorry, apologies. But thank you so much for that response, Pierre. And thank you as well to all our other speakers, John Rob, Jose Alberto, Michelle, and Luisa. Thank you very much for your time. To our wonderful audience who have been engaged and been typing, and to all of the people who have been part of organizing this webinar. Thank you very much. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.